say good morning again. My name is Matt Stone. I'm the lead pastor here and honored to be in worship with you this morning as we finish up a series on the book of Ruth. This is the fourth week that we spent in Ruth. If you missed the first 3 weeks, I hope you'll get a chance to go back and listen to those messages online if you have that opportunity, but we'll catch you up, so don't worry about it. I got to tell you, yesterday was our daughter's first basketball game of the year. Our daughter is Charlotte. She's 13. She's in 8th grade. She decided 3 minutes before tryouts that she wanted to be on the basketball team, and so she practiced for less than that amount of time, and somehow managed to make the basketball team and played, and it was great. But it was like the second of that kind of event. She did the same thing with cheerleading at the end of last year. She just decided that she was going to be a cheerleader. She's never done that in her life. And she spent almost no time practicing and then just made the cheerleading team. We don't really know. It's a point of conversation for me and Margaret because we typically the conversation will go like this. How? Like, where does she learn that? Our son does the same thing. He just decided to join the wrestling team, and so he's on the wrestling team and suddenly knows how to do wrestling. I've never wrestled a day in my life. Where do they get the courage for this kind of thing? This is what Margaret and I talk about. Where do they get the courage to try things that they have never tried? Because I got to tell you, I was not that kid. If I didn't know that I was going to be great at it, then I didn't try. And that meant I didn't try a lot of things, because I wasn't great at an awful lot of things. That's where I came from. So Margaret and I talk about this on a pretty regular basis, and it's hilarious to me because my wife doesn't get it. My wife doesn't understand where they get these things because it comes from her. She was the one who always has the courage to try new things. Whether she knows she's going to be good at it or not, she just goes and tries and enjoys the process. That's where our kids got it from. I don't have to wonder, where'd they get that from? Because I know where they got that from. They got it from my wife. They got it from Margaret. She has passed on that legacy. That question, where do they get that from, I think is a really helpful conversation to have, a really helpful question to ask when we come to stories like Ruth's stories. Where do they get that from? Specifically, where does Boaz get this from? If you weren't with us the last couple of weeks, the story goes something like this. Pastor Sean started us off a few weeks ago with Naomi's story. She leaves Bethlehem. She's married. She has 2 sons. She moves to a place called Moab, which is the worst kind of place, but they had a little bit of food there. Things go awful there. Her husband dies. Her 2 sons die. Naomi decides to return to Bethlehem, where she's from, because life is not going as planned. Some of us know what it's like to suddenly find ourselves in a season or in a place where we did not plan to be. Naomi knows that place. Only Naomi has interpreted that season in her life to mean that God has turned his hand against her. And so she has been abandoned by God. That's what Naomi believes. She's been abandoned by God. So she's returning to Bethlehem. Her daughter-in-law, Ruth, decides to go with her. As she comes back into that city, Naomi says, look, I know my name is Naomi. I know that means pleasant, but don't call me that anymore because my life is anything but. Instead, you can call me Mara, which means bitter, because that's who I am now. I'm bitter because of all that has happened. More specifically, I'm bitter because of all that God has done to me. And so we're left with questions like, is that how God works? Is that where it comes from? Is that how this thing works? And then we explored chapter 2, and we're introduced a little bit more fully into Ruth's state of mind. We're introduced to Ruth's character and integrity and courage and faithfulness, and she shows up as just an absolute monument of a woman who knows how to be loyal, how to be faithful. She is an extraordinary woman in the life of the entire Old Testament. Really, it's the entire Bible. And so we meet Ruth. Ruth decides that she's going to go into the fields to try to collect some food. She meets a man there named Boaz. We met Boaz. Boaz was very nice. He's a nice guy. He gives Ruth a ton of food, lets her rest, protects her, offers protection and provision. Ruth goes home, tells her mother-in-law, Naomi, hey, I worked in Boaz's field. Naomi says, great, that's one of our relatives. And so in chapter 3, what we hear is Naomi sends Ruth out to ask and really in a lot of ways plead with Boaz, will you be our kinsman redeemer, is the word that we were introduced to last week. The Hebrew word there is goel. A kinsman redeemer in the ancient Israelite culture was one whose responsibility was to care for members of the family who had been lost due to life's crippling circumstances like war or debt or death. The kinsman redeemer, the goel, their job was to go pay the debt on behalf of that lost family member, to go fight for their release from captivity, if that's what was called for, or if they had been lost to the normal structure of society because of death, the kinsman redeemer's job was to bring them into the family, to bring them into the wings of God's refuge, so to speak. And so Boaz hears that question from Ruth, will you be our kinsman redeemer? And Boaz's response is absolutely, right? Boaz refuses to succumb to any kind of temptation. We see that Ruth wasn't trying to do anything untoward toward Boaz. Boaz responds, I will be your kinsman redeemer. I will fulfill this responsibility. I will care for you. I will protect you. I will provide for you and for Naomi and for your children. And so the question that I land at the end of chapter 3 with is, where does Boaz learn that from? Where does he get that from? And the answer is he gets it from the same place that we all get it. Right? Boaz learns how to show up when faced with someone who is lost or broken or wounded or afraid or alone. Boaz learns how to show up in front of those people from the same source that you and I learned how to show up. And by the way, as an aside, some of us learn from previous generations how to show up. Some of us learn how not to show up. We're going to deal with that in a different sermon a long time from now. But for now, just go with me. Boaz learns how to show up the same place that you and I learned. And here's what stunned me. 2 weeks ago at the end of the 9:30 service, this was after we looked at Ruth chapter 2, a man named Jim Roy comes out of the service. Some of you know Jim. He's been a longtime member of our church. He comes out of the service and he says, well, you know where Boaz learned how to do this, right? And I said, no, I've never really actually given that any thought. And then he told me who Boaz's mother was. Boaz's mother. This is a fascinating story that you have to search long and hard to find, and you don't find it until Matthew chapter 1. That's when you learn who Boaz's mother was. Boaz's mother was a Gentile prostitute who helped Joshua to conquer Jericho and allow Israel to take possession of the promised land. So a generation before our story, Israel is outside the promised land. They're waiting to come inside. They're looking at Jericho, which is a fortified city. They're saying, we don't know how to get in there. We don't know how to go to this place that God has called us to go. So Joshua sends some spies. The spies encounter Rahab. I don't know how to explain it. I don't really know. I don't know what they were doing there. It makes me uncomfortable. We preached about this before, so y'all go look that up. So the spies have a conversation with Rahab. Rahab frees them and delivers them, makes it possible for Joshua and Israel to come into Jericho and conquer Jericho and take possession of the promised land. Rahab was a Gentile prostitute who was on the outside. She had no standing in Israel. She had no value in Israel. And yet somehow she was brought under the refuge of God's wings because of her act of faithfulness, because of her act of courage. She was brought into Israel's family, so to speak. Rahab's son is Boaz. You want to know where Boaz learned how to treat people who were on the outside of society? You want to know where Boaz learned how to treat people who are wounded or lost or broken or afraid? He learned it from his mother because he heard that story over and over again growing up. He heard what it meant to be on the outside looking in. He heard what it meant to feel like you had a family, to be part of God's own family. The reason Boaz knows how to treat Ruth the Moabite, yuck, is because Boaz had heard that story over and over again. Where did he learn it from? He learned it from his mother, Rahab. And here's the other thing that I love about that. I've been studying Ruth for, 15 years. I never knew that. But Jim Roy comes out and blows my mind after the 9:30 service. That's what Scripture is. Scripture is meant to be read and studied in a community. It's not the case that one person has all of the knowledge about the Bible. It's that when we come together to this text, we allow God to speak through all of us, and all of us can learn. I love that part of the story. It's not related to the sermon, but I do love it, that that's what happens in Scripture. It knows no depths. Scripture knows no depths. We cannot plumb the depths of all of the meaning in Scripture by ourselves. It takes being part of a community. So, at the end of chapter 3, where we left off with Ruth and Boaz in particular, was Boaz said, I will be your Goel, I will be your kinsman redeemer, but there's someone else who's a little bit more closely related. In other words, there's someone else who has a prior right to fulfill this responsibility for you. So we need to see, is that other guy going to fulfill this responsibility? And Boaz tells Ruth, if he doesn't, I will. Chapter 4 begins then the next morning. And it starts at the city gates, which is a gathering place. This is where all the legal business in ancient Israel would have taken place, was at the city gates. The elders have gathered. Boaz is there, and this other relative is there too. Boaz sees him, and Boaz sidles up next to this other relative and says, hey, I have got a great deal for you. Maybe you've heard that Naomi has returned from Moab, and she is selling her husband's land. She is selling Elimelech's land, and you, as the closest relative, have the first right of refusal. Is that a piece of land that you want to buy? And this other relative, who's never named, which I love, this other relative says, oh, well, that sounds like a great idea. I would love to have more property. That sounds like a great business opportunity for me and my family. And Boaz says, oh, and by the way, when you buy the property, you also will get to fulfill the responsibility to take Ruth and Naomi into your house. And this other relative, unnamed, says, oh, yeah, well, I mean, that sounds expensive. And I kind of had thought about washing my hair today. And so I don't really want to do that. And I love it because it is so public. This man has publicly, right? The city gates are where legal business for the community takes place. Bethlehem is a small community. Everybody's there. This man has publicly made a fool of himself because the opportunity that Boaz gives him is simply this. Will you be who God made you to be? Will you fulfill the responsibility that God has called you to fulfill as part of caring for those who are least and last and lost? Will you take care of these two widows? And this man has the gall to say he's got to wash his hair today. Publicly, he's done, and nobody remembers his name. I don't think that's an accident. Nobody remembers his name. And what does Boaz do? He says, I will fulfill my responsibility. I will be the kinsman redeemer. Remember, our concept, the Christian concept of redemption, comes from this kind of context. I will redeem your land. I will redeem your family. That's what Boaz commits to and then follows through on. And we hear later on that they seal the deal with something about a shoe. You're going to have to go read that part. If you can figure it out, great. You come tell me what that business is about, because I still don't know. After this deal is sealed, in other words, after Ruth and Boaz become husband and wife, the elders and the townsfolk who are gathered there they pronounce a kind of threefold blessing over Ruth and Boaz. And I want you to hear that because it's so interesting what happens. This is in Ruth chapter 4. I'm going to start in verse 11. We are witnesses. In other words, we all see this. We are all witnesses. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house, they're talking to Boaz about Ruth. May the Lord make the woman who's coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. And if you're not super familiar with the Old Testament, Rachel and Leah are pivotal people in the Old Testament. They are the mothers of the 12 tribes of Israel. That's the blessing pronounced over Ruth, the Moabite. Yuck. May you be like our most venerated parents. May you be like the ones who gave us the 12 tribes of Israel. It's an extraordinary blessing pronounced over the last person you would expect, Ruth the Moabite. May you be like Rachel and Leah, who together built up the house of Israel. May you produce children in Ephrathah, which is the region around Bethlehem, and bestow a name in Bethlehem. In other words, may your children be famous in Bethlehem. Just tuck that one away. We're going to revisit that later this morning. May your children be famous in Bethlehem. And through the children that the Lord will give you by this young woman, by Ruth, may your house be like the house of Perez, whom Tamar bore to Judah. That's another story. If you're not familiar with Genesis in particular, Go back and read it. We can't deal with it in church because it is way too racy. So go back and read it when your kids are asleep. Go back and read the story of Tamar and Judah. But know this, may your house be like Perez. Perez's mother was Tamar. Tamar was another Gentile woman outside the boundaries of society whom God managed to bring inside the family of God. May your kids be brought into the family of God. This is the blessing. It's an extraordinary threefold blessing. And then the story continues. What we hear is that Boaz and Ruth conceive a child. And remember that this story begins with Ruth being married to Naomi's son Mahlon, and for 10 years they weren't able to have children. This is part of the reason that Naomi says, God's hand has turned against me. And the question we've been asking throughout is that true? What we find at the end of Ruth is a resounding no. God's hand has not turned against you, Naomi, because look, Ruth has conceived a child with Boaz. And then in verse 14, the women say to Naomi, blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day. Naomi was the one. I'll say it for like the 15th time over the last 4 weeks. Naomi thought God abandoned her. And again and again and again, we see God has not abandoned Naomi. And now the women of the community are saying, look, you are not alone. This child is a sign of God's presence and blessing in your life. You are not alone, Naomi. You are not Mara. You are not bitter. You are Naomi. You are pleasant. You are with God. That's what they say to her. And then in verse 15, it says, he shall be to you, talking about this child, he shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law who loves you, Ruth, who loves you, has born, who is more to you than 7 sons, has borne him to you. Right? The women of the community say, look, Ruth is so valuable. Everybody in our culture, and speaking of their culture, everybody in their culture valued sons because sons offered protection, provision, cheap labor, etc. Well, these women say to Ruth, or say to Naomi, Ruth is worth more than 10 of those smelly boys. That's who Ruth is. That's the value that Ruth the Moabite, now has in Bethlehem's story, in Naomi's story. Then Naomi took the child, in verse 16, then Naomi took the child and laid him in her bosom and became her nurse. And just imagine, just consider the transformation, the turnaround in Naomi's story. She left full, came back empty, and now once again she is full. She left a family, she became an unfamily, and now once again she is family. God has restored her fully. This child is a sign of hope yet to come. Naomi's story has come full circle. The core question that Naomi asked at the beginning, has God left me? Has God abandoned me? Has been answered in resounding fashion in the form of this child. And now listen to this. The women of the neighborhood gave him a name, saying, a son has been born to Naomi, and they named him Obed, which means servant, by the way. They named him Obed, and he became the father of Jesse, and Jesse became the father of David. And it's hard to overstate at this point the absolute atomic bomb that was just dropped at the end of Ruth's story. It blows up everything. Because the David who is the great-grandson of Ruth, the great-great-grandson of Naomi, the great-great-great-grandson of Rahab, that David is the same David who fights Goliath. That David is the same David who is anointed as a man after God's own heart. That David is the same David who becomes the greatest king in Israel's history. That it turns out all of Ruth's story is the story of David's ancestors. You want to know how David became a leader? Do you want to know how David became courageous? Do you want to know how David became a man after God's own heart? It's because he heard the story over and over again growing up. He heard the story of his great-great-great-grandmother, Rahab, whose faith and courage was extraordinary. He heard the story over and over and over again about his great-great-grandmother, Naomi, who thought God had abandoned her. But it turns out, she finds out that God was with her the entire time. You don't know how David becomes a man after God's own heart? Because he heard the story of Ruth and Boaz, his great-grandparents, whose faithfulness, integrity, courage, character was life-changing. The legacy that Ruth and Boaz received collectively, the legacy that they received, they passed on, and it changed the world because their great-grandson becomes the one, not only who is the greatest king in Israel's history, but he becomes the one to whom God promises a Messiah. The root of our hope for Christ is found not just in David's story. It's found in Ruth's story, in Boaz's story, in Naomi's story, in Rahab's stories, all bound together by pain which did not go away, but bound together also by the realization, again and again in life, that there is yet hope.